Right. Great. Thanks, Steve, for inviting me to give this talk today. And I love that you're suggesting that you watch this with your family later. My family just says I talk about data all the time. So I think that's an excellent plan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have some slides to walk through, and I'll give a little context for kind of how I am going to talk about things. But this also is a pretty small group. So this can be a conversation. If you have questions or comments, you can go ahead and put your question or comment in the chat, or just like raise your hand. Steve is going to keep an eye on things there. Okay. Share my screen, go present. Oops. Okay, great. So I'm here today to talk about the role of data repositories in open research, and I am the executive director of Dryad. I've been here about a year now, just chatting about that at the beginning. And so I come at this conversation and also my role at Dryad of having been a researcher. I worked in microbial ecology and metagenomics for many years, sort of lastly at Michigan State University, but then also as an executive director of data carpentry. And the carpentry is really thinking about data access and bringing people to data and data to people. And so I always like to talk about data in all of these these different contexts. So I wanted to start out just actually with a little bit around like, what is data? And so if we really are talking about it, there's, you can share sort of the figures in your manuscript, and that is a sense of the data. But when we're talking about data in this context, what we're really talking about are the values behind those averages or standard deviations that you have in your manuscript. They can be the images themselves, or if you're running those images through an analysis, like what's the images that you're extracting from those things. If you're doing more qualitative research, de-identified answers to interviews or surveys. So there are all the necessary information to evaluate, reuse, or reproduce your research. So just having sort of the figure there isn't enough to really understand how that figure came together. So this is really a way to share more information about your project, but also let other people use and rebuild on it. And oftentimes the person building on it is future you. So as we think about a lot of these things, we have the context of the research community, but a lot of times really the person that's building on the work is you or a close collaborator. So again, kind of going through a few terms. Open data, so data that can be freely used, reused, redistributed. There's different types of licensing, but the open has that free to use or reuse element to it. A data repository, a place where data can be preserved, accessible, and citable. And I'll be honest, before coming to Dryad, I didn't really appreciate the difference in like what a repository was versus a place where you just sort of put up your data so other people can see it. And so a key element in the repository is the preserved, because it's long-term preservation. So a lot of times if you put something on GitHub, that could just go away. The repository really ensures the long-term preservation. Data publication, sharing your open data in a repository or platform that grants stable identifiers for reuse. So again, the preservation is an issue, but also the identifier that's going to stay the same. The GitHub repository, you can change the name, you could get rid of it. The publication piece adds the DOI, so it's always accessible at that URL or that DOI. Metadata is the information needed to understand your data set, so the data about the data. Just spoke a little bit to the idea of the persistent identifier, but that's the DOI is one we run across frequently with manuscripts, but accession numbers like for GenBank, those are identifiers that are unique to that product. And then a data citation is recognizing or attributed data you have used with a persistent identifier in an article citation format or other. So this is an opportunity to link the data to other related works and to get appropriate recognition and linkage for the data as a primary research product. So that's the other thing that we really are talking through and starting to recognize as a community, is that it's not just the manuscript that's important, that the software is its own product, that the data is its own research product, and how do we work with those as sort of first-class research products. So why should we bother publishing data? So the first is sort of is compliance. So a lot of different granting agencies are requiring that data be shared. So NIH has policies, continuing to develop policies, NSF. We work with the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. They have a lot of requirements around sharing data and software. So there's a lot of different funding agencies that are making these requirements or strong suggestions, as well as manuscripts. So right now, when you're submitting a paper, you often are asked to share, maybe not often enough, but are asked to share your data. So one piece of this is just to be compliant. And then the other is around research progress. So these are sort of different surveys, but one aspect is 73% of academics say access to research data helps them in their work, or scientists can't replicate studies by their peers. And if there's funding cuts in science agencies, it's important than ever to embrace transparency and data sharing. So even when things are shared through things like government sites, we might not necessarily know that they're going to be sustained. So how can we, with our research data, make that available? So it's an overall progress for the field, and as well as a thing that is coming to be more important within compliance. The other great thing is that we're starting to see just the more general adoption of data sharing practices. So it's also just becoming more a part of a community of practice and an expectation within disciplines. So I'm using Dryad data because that's what I have access to. And so we've had increasing numbers of publications. We were founded in 2010 by a community of researchers who wanted to improve data sharing in ecology and evolution. So they got together and they made some guidance for the journals. And then they founded Dryad as a place for people to share that data. And so now, they're in 2010, and now in 2020, we published almost 8,000 data sets last year. And this is true across all different types of repositories that we're seeing increases in data sharing. This really does vary by discipline. Dryad does have a lot in the ecology, evolution, life sciences space, but we're starting to see it pick up in other disciplines as well. Okay, great. Of course, now we want to share our data. We want to publish our data. So where can we publish our data? Okay, so general data repositories. So here's a bunch of them. So these are all repositories that take many different kinds of data. And so they're general. You probably recognize a few on this list here. But there's also disciplinary repositories. So general repositories, well, it's any data type, but then because there's so much variability in types of data, the kind of metadata they ask for or the kind of way they share things has to be relatively general. Disciplinary repositories are ones that are designed for specific data types or specific disciplines. So they can ask more questions about the data, like require a particular format or certain metadata information. And so those are, if you have data that should go in a disciplinary repository, then that's really the best place for it. It's also where other researchers are going to look for it first. So this is some example of disciplinary repositories, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of disciplinary repositories. The other place, so this is discipline, is also institutional repositories. So many institutions at their institution will have an institutional repository. So you might not be aware of it, but the librarians are the people who are really doing this work. So they'll always know the answer. They are great resources. I just want to put that plug out there if you're thinking about data publishing, data metadata. Your librarians are fantastic resources. They have a lot of information. They can point you at things that can help in any of your data practices. So those kinds of repositories at your institution can also be a good resource. I'm going to speak briefly of the idea of sensitive data. So one thing that's important is that it's your responsibility to ensure your data are anonymized, de-identified, and have proper consents to be shared. And I think something that we've seen at Dryad with maybe COVID in particular is that there are people coming into the field of working with human subjects data that don't necessarily have the training around how to work with that data. So I'll speak a bit about our curation process, but that's where we're communicating with authors and requiring that they make changes. So there is a kind of a bit of learning around this. So just something to be aware of. If that's the type of data that you're working with, there are certain things to consider. But also that it means that you might choose a different type of data repository. So like Dryads are all public domain when they're published. If you do need to share more private data for the study to be useful, then you need to find a repository that can have those kinds of protections, HIPAA requirements. So just something to be aware of is that if that's the type of data you work with. Similarly, it can apply to data that be maybe culturally sensitive, or things like endangered species, like not giving away GPS coordinates. So being thoughtful at this stage as well is important, and finding the right place that can protect the data in the appropriate way. Okay, so those are all like sort of considerations around data repositories on a somewhat sort of theoretical level, like what's important, what do I need to be thinking about? And so a lot of different repositories will sort of meet those requirements. The other part that I want to speak to is how it integrates with a researcher workflow. And that, again, kind of coming at this with multiple hats. My experience as a researcher was often that I like theoretically wanted to do something, but then I couldn't figure out how. And my PI was like, well, we just have to do this thing. And I didn't have time to figure it out. And so how can we think about the ease of submission? So making this easy for researchers, as well as being something that we theoretically want to do. So I'm going to speak a little bit about how Dryad approaches it, but these are sort of all things to look for when you're thinking about a data repository. So this is how our system works. There's always some kind of login. We use ORCID. That is for us, so we don't have any information like personally identifiable information, but it's also to be able to connect your data products to your ORCID, right? Your professional identity there. You submit, so you can upload your data and your files and receive a citable DOI. So it's really the process for us is go to the page, enter the metadata, upload your data files, and you can do that either through like upload from your computer or from a link. So like if you have a Dropbox or something like that, you can put that link in. So you're not downloading from somewhere else and then uploading back to Dryad. One step that we have, and I'll speak a little bit more about this, that not everyone has, is that we do curate every data set. So like I mentioned, for human subjects information, but there are other things that we're checking on every data set. So if we see things within your data set that we think should be changed or add more information, we'll get in touch with you. About 25% of our data sets, we correspond with the author asking for some changes. And overall, I would say, that's appreciated. It definitely can be like, oh my goodness, I have to do one more thing. But the way we really approach it is to help people. So it's not, you can't publish, but here's a way to make it better. So think of it as an opportunity to provide some information as an education about the process. And then finally publish, and then you get your citation. So we try to make it relatively straightforward. A lot of repositories will have a very similar process. So those are things to look for, but just kind of like, okay, how do I log in? Is it integrated with other systems? What are the steps? One other thing, and I'm highlighting this because I'm excited about it, is one thing that we've just recently launched is an integration with Zenoto. So you can see here, this is what I was saying, like describe your data set, upload your data. We now also have an upload software button. And so you can share your data and your software through the same process of submitting and sharing your data files. So this is really great because we see a lot that, the data has code associated with it. And that's really important for understanding the analysis. But there are different considerations for software, different licensing, different availability. So the upload software, that's all going to Zenoto as an integration with Zenoto. But for you, for a researcher, they just have this one place to come to go through this process. So I mentioned kind of this upload aspect here. Then again, we ask that you confirm this, but we'll work with you if we see challenges. And then another thing to think about as you're thinking about sharing your data is like when you want to do it. And so we do still see that a lot of data sharing happens at the time of manuscript submission. And that's fine and great. And so, but a lot of times maybe you're not quite ready to publish the data. You want it to come out at the same time as the manuscript. So we have this private for peer review feature that lets you put up your data and gives you a link. I think I have it here. It gives you a link that you can use to put in your paper while it's being reviewed. That's for both the code and the software. There's one for code and now for software as well. So that lets your data be accessible to reviewers. So it can be part of the review process, but isn't published for the world yet. You could also not check this button and publish your data whenever you wanted. And I'm talking a lot about manuscripts because we know that's a point that people come to us, but you can publish data. It does not need to be associated with the manuscript. You can do it at any time. Okay, this is just one thing here, is to speak to kind of the partners that support this, is to say that we do have a data publishing charge for this long-term preservation. And this is sort of something to think about is cost, but also like not your cost, but sort of who is paying for something and how is this being supported long-term. So what's great is that some journals and institutions are supporting Dryad and supporting their researchers and data sharing. So if we're thinking about that process, whether I'm speaking about kind of what we're looking for, but if you're thinking about publishing your data somewhere else, these are things that you can think about as you're publishing your data. So descriptive metadata, your title, your authors, affiliations, abstract, funding, and then usage information. So how can someone reuse these? What's the names of the columns in your data set? Is there any notes? Are there any missing fields? And so we have a whole page actually on good data practices that we refer people to when they're thinking about this as well. You want to think about the human subjects data, sensitive information. And then other things that we're always looking for that you can check too, is that your files can be opened. Maybe have a colleague try it, not just you, because you might have some software on your computer that you don't even know that you have. And then conflicting copyright. So not sharing something that doesn't have the same copyright as what you're trying to, as the place that you're putting your data, or not sharing things that you don't have permission to share. All right, are there questions so far?
So we do have one question about
Great.
identifiers.
Oh, good.
And I'll ask it.
Okay.
So is there a definition or requirement that makes a persistent identifier really persistent? For example, I've seen unique identifiers for genetic code that was hosted on a platform that no longer exists. Unlikely GenBank will go away, but is there any assurance that a repository will be persistent?
Yeah, so GenBank's a really good example because their identifiers are sort of not necessarily totally persistent. Yes, GenBank won't go away, but they have a different mechanism for creating those identifiers. So that's why we use, and actually this feeds well into my next slide, is that there are communities-based standards. So ORCID is one of them. Like, that's not going to go away. That's an organization committed just to this, widely used, sustainable organization standard in the space. And so one thing is to look at, what are the community-based standards? So ORCID is one of those. The other one that we use is called WAR, and it's like ORCIDs for institutions. And then another that's a newer project is Make Data Count. And that's a set of metrics around views, downloads, and citations for data. So rather than creating our own metrics or measurements, they're not really metrics, but we are integrating with other projects that are standards in the space. So, right, not just any number is unique and will stay around forever. That's a really good point.
There are a couple of it. The questions are rolling
Perfect.
in now.
Yay.
So another question, are the reviews that go back to the submitter typically because the data themselves are messy, or are they more often in need of more metadata? And are there metadata standards that submitters follow or need to follow?
Yes. So most often it's more information about how to use the data. So asking for usage notes or readmes. So for, that we have a whole list of different software we can use to open things, and a lot of experience working with a lot of data files. But if a curator doesn't understand, what your data set means or how to open it, that's a good sign that another researcher wouldn't be able to do that. So we'll ask for more information. So most of our requests are there, but some of them are around data file integrity, like we can't open it. So we have a partnership coming up with Frictionless Data that is going to look at tabular data and help guide people to make better tabular data. Right now, we don't get back to you and say, oh, you have 2 tabs and it's better practice to only have 1 tab. If we can understand that data, that's still okay. We think about kind of a good, better, best progression, and we're in the better phase. So we're encouraging good practices, but we're not requiring that you have, a CSV only in the way that you would like the data carpentry, good data organization structure. So we have some flexibility there. So more of the feedback is around, being able to open the files, usage notes, more descriptive information, and then human subjects.
And then one last question in the chat for now. Can one publish a data set and then later associate it with a publication? So if you are ready with the data now and you get a publication out later.
Great. Yes. Let me see if I have I wonder if I have oh, I don't have a slide with that. Okay. Yes. So we have a related work section. And so you can, at the time of submission, you can put links in. So, but you could come back anytime and update your data set and add in links to manuscripts, even multiple manuscripts. So one of the things that we do, and then again, something else to think about generally as you're thinking about data repositories is versioning. So you want to be able to update your data set, but you also want to have the provenance that it was updated. So if someone used your data set from, last year, and then now, you updated it and now it's a different data set, they're like, well, nothing works anymore. Then it's like, oh, well, that's that version. So you want to make sure that you're tracking the versions. So if you see this data files thing here, if there were multiple times that someone had submitted different data files, you would see multiple of those. And so you would always see the versions, and then you can always update the metadata and related works as well.
Can I have a quick follow-up? And then there's another question that we'll get to, and then maybe we can continue. Are there DOIs minted for the individual versions? So could you reference the version 2 versions ago in a paper or the most recent version? Is that a possibility?
For us and in most places, Zenoto works the same way. It's a single DOI. So it would be the DOI and then the version would be what you would cite.
Okay. And then the last question here in the chat for now, do you reject or discourage file formats based on preservation friendliness?
Maybe whoever asked that could expand on that question. Is that about sort of like being able to open it with proprietary software kind of question?
I think it's, although if the asker would like to unmute and ask the question, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that's right. I'm just wondering about whether you restrict to open formats or at least discourage proprietary or closed ones.
We don't restrict to open formats. Some fields, the standard is a closed format. So I'll take like neurology and MATLAB, for example. The field in general uses MATLAB. So to have people put things in other formats would actually be worse for the data sharing and reuse. But we do encourage open formats, and right, again, the curator needs to be able to open and review the files. So if it is software that we can't get access to, then it's not okay, essentially. But we do try. I mean, other things as examples are like maybe files from a microscope that does require proprietary information or proprietary software, but has a lot of information in it that you only really can get by opening it within the context of that microscopy software. So we encourage open file formats, but we don't restrict to it.
Thank you.
Great. So that's the last question for now. We'll probably
okay, great. I love the questions. All right, I'll pause more frequently. So I think the other thing that we really think about and maybe gets at some of the questions too is around integrations and partnerships. So a data repository is a part of a broad ecosystem. And so how does it integrate with those things? Does it work well? Are there like-minded partners? And so some of the integrations that we have, again, Dryad started 10 years ago, it started with some journals. And so from the start, we worked with researchers and journals. And so we have these publisher integrations. And again, like these were not things that I was aware existed very much before I started at Dryad. But when you go to submit a paper or review a paper, there are publisher platforms. And each journal and each publisher uses one of them. And there are some smaller ones, but some bigger ones in the space. And so rather than necessarily like integrating with every single journal, you can integrate with these publisher platforms. And so you can reach a lot of different journals. So we have some individual journal integrations. We're going to have some more publisher integrations this year. But what that means is, again, is just that at that point when you're submitting your manuscript, that you're going to be able to select Dryad or some other repositories like Mendeley and Figshare, and then kind of be come over to those systems, do your data, and then like come back to your submission. So that is a nice thing for researchers, that it's like all a part of that submission process, rather than being sort of like yet another thing that you need to figure out where to go. But then on the other side of this is, I've talked a lot about the submission. The other part is about the reuse, like how do I get access to this data? So Dryad has APIs so that you can access things through those APIs. You don't need to just like go to Dryad and download everything individually from the page. And so with that, there's an R OpenSci package for Dryad, so you can download data from Dryad, work with the Jupyter and Binder team, protocols.io. So the R OpenSci one is live. There's other sort of Jupyter strategies and things we're working on. But that's the other side is, how is that data repository going to fit into people's workflow on the reuse side as well? Any questions here? Right.
No questions in the chat.
Great. Okay, so then kind of the last step, great, your data is out there, it's very exciting and people can reuse it, and you have your DOI and you like print out that DOI and put it on your fridge because you're excited, and you talk with your family about data all the time. But then, what's the impact of that data? And so I think that that's, again, kind of an exciting space right now, is that manuscripts have impact, but also the data or the software, those products in and of themselves can have impact. And so I did speak to this, is this idea of, thinking about who we're reaching with our data sets, and being able to understand that and then share that, just like think about it yourself, but also share it with maybe other people who care about the impact of your work, like a hiring committee or tenure and promotion. And I will say, like, we're kind of like, so Daniela Lowenberg leads this Make Data Count project and the Zenoto integration too. And, so she's thinking really, really deeply about this idea. And we're like a little ahead of the game in terms of people necessarily really caring about these, and you always want to be careful with any kind of metric. Right now, like tenure committees are not saying how many people viewed your data set. But, having this kind of information already here helps us think about how to look at it within sort of the evaluations framework, or just even for you personally to see how things are being used. And we don't track any information about like IP address or anything, so we don't know who's using it or where is using it. We just have the sort of the numbers, but I think it gives a sense of what things are important to people. The other thing it has is it had kind of that list there with the citations. Whoops. The citations, so we're pulling from Crossref. And so we can see the list of works that are referencing the data set. So you don't have to do anything. It's right there. So that's nice to see. There are some challenges with how data citations are handled. So it doesn't all come through, but this is kind of another nice integration. So overall, I think kind of what we wanted to talk about here, and I did use Dryad as an example, but also kind of thinking broadly about this space of open data, is that reproducibility, transparency, and reuse and better science rely on more than data. They rely on that data being accessible and available, and people having access to them to turn the data into knowledge. So all the pieces that we kind of talk about and harp on around, maybe file formats and metadata are all geared towards really that connecting the people with the data to have impact. I'm going to stop sharing. So I have a slide here that has links to like our product board. So yes, we're an open project. So everything's open source. So you could check out the product board. If you want to try stuff out, you can. But yeah, let me pause here and see what questions people have.
That's great. Thank you, Tracy. We have a question in the chat, but I have a question I'd like to get to before that, because we were just talking about integrations, and especially I was noticing the integrations with things like Binder, not integrations necessarily, but
Right.
the discussion around those. And I wonder, does the curatorial process really dig into whether something like a Binder notebook is functional? Like, does the process go that deep into those tools, or is it more kind of on the surface?
So like if you shared a Binder notebook as part, we do run them.
Okay.
So we try to make sure that that code runs. We'll do a little less of that actually with the Zenoto integration, because software will go to Zenoto and we won't review the software. We'll focus more on the data, which so we are looking at that. I think one of the things that we've gotten a couple questions now from journals that, you know, there is more attention around data and data integrity. And what we can't do is say, does this data like connect to the conclusions in the paper? Right, like the paper is saying this data says this. Does it really say this? You know, we don't have that context. One, we don't often have access to the manuscript. But two, you know, that just requires a lot more disciplinary expertise than, you know, and time, honestly, that we would have. But I think that that's a really, those conversations are really great because it's about, you know, how could it be sort of clear what we do and then be clear about what someone else does. Like, we're checking for these things, now you check for these things. And, you know, maybe that's the reviewer, maybe that's someone at a journal staff. So I think that those are great conversations to see where, you know, what you're looking for connect up, because even if we're running the code, we're not like checking the validity of the output, right? We couldn't do that. All we can say is like, yes, this runs. And paths, don't get me started on paths.
Yeah, I mean, data curation.
That's hard. That's a hard thing in sharing software, is making sure you get the paths right.
Right.
Not
right.
including hard-coded paths. But yeah.
Okay. Another question here in the chat. Regarding sensitive data, has Dryad considered implementing features that restrict access to sensitive data, or is a long-term plan to remain an open data repository?
Yeah, our focus is on remaining an open data repository, but there are other projects that are focusing on the sensitive data. So one of the ones that came out are these through COVID, what are these called fair data points. And the idea is to create a way to share like medical information. So sensitive information, but like have you be able to like stand up a fair data point in a certain place and like have them connect with each other and have those kinds of privacy standards. So that is unlikely to be our focus. There's just a lot that you have to think about infrastructure wise that's different than how we do things now. But yeah, that's an important part of the space too, because sometimes that information is important, right? Epidemiology in making conclusions, but you need to be careful in protecting the privacy of the patients or the participants. Had a whole conversation about like hashing and
certainly gets complicated.
Yeah, no, it's exciting, but yeah, that's not where we're likely to focus. Yeah.
Right. Do we have any other questions from folks in the audience here? Feel free to unmute yourself or type into the chat.
A quick question. I was wondering if the data citation was not handled properly, as you said, and it wasn't able to be pulled in automatically, will you be able to add it manually if you find a paper that is using that data? Is that able to be added to the list of the,
You couldn't add it to the citation list, but you could add it as a related work. So you could put that information in. Yeah.
Thanks.
Related to that, Tracy, do you know, are journals, this is a very big question, so feel free to kick the can down the road, but are journals making any effort at this point to correct that data citation problem? So we see people citing a data set in acknowledgements or other spaces that can't be captured as a citation. Is there any kind of effort to retroactively go through journals and flag those citations even though they're not cited properly that you know of?
I don't know. I mean, so I think, PLOS is doing a lot in this space of kind of looking at data citations. I think they just released a report, or Ian just posted a report. So yeah, I think it depends, where people want to put the energy. You certainly could scan through, pull those citations out and put them in another place. And some journals have like a systematic kind of like open research place now where those things are going. But it is still a little distributed in terms of like where people decide to put things.
I see Alex is
Yeah.
saying that
Is
DataCite's working on that. Great.
Yeah. So it's definitely a very active conversation. And so it's.
Alex, I'm gonna ask you to also ask your other question.
Alex,
Tracy,
I saw your data set came in. I will answer your question, but I also saw your data set, and I wish I was looking at it just before this meeting.
I saw that. I saw Tracy Teal is currently editing this. So.
Yeah, I might reformat your table, just so it looks a little nicer. But
okay,
it looks good. It looks good. Thank you for sharing. And so Alex did just share a data set. He did an excellent job in his metadata of saying the column names and what all of them meant in CSV format. So yes, thank you, Alex. But generally, yes. Sorry, go ahead, ask your question and I'll answer.
No, I'm just wondering, typically, what's a typical review turnaround time? Is it a day? Is it a week?
So we aim to get back to authors within 48 hours, not of 40-hour working days. And so that doesn't mean that we necessarily publish it in that, but that we've gotten back to the author and said, hey, we'd like to see some changes. So depending on volume, that can vary, like 48, 72 hours, but it's in that range.
Great,
yeah.
thank you.
So I do think that that's something that's also a little bit different about our process, is that is like a relatively quick turnaround for curation. A lot of institutional repositories do a really great job on curation, and they're kind of digging into some of more of the things that maybe you've mentioned, and then that process takes longer. So we really know that this is important to authors to have feedback quickly, and so that our process is in that 48 to 72 hour range. Big data sets can take longer. I mean, if it's 250 gigabytes, just like downloading it or getting access takes longer, but yeah.
Do you have any general thoughts, Tracy, on repositories that do versus don't do curation on deposits?
So I think Mendeley now has some curation, but it's sort of like different tiers, whether they curate or not. I think Figshare is starting some curation. So, but most don't have this as a part of the process. The institutional ones do. Just saying Disciplinary often do. But in terms of like generalist repositories, we are the most systematic, like we curate everything that comes through. But we're also focused on data. If you're looking at like Figshare, Zenoto, they have a lot of different types of research products that people share there. So it's just a little bit of a different model.
Right.
And I think, one of the things so Dryad's also part of the data curation network, and something we ask is, what's the value of curation? Our researchers, do they see that value? And I don't know, I think maybe sometimes, but I think a lot of times just because of where data is in the research life cycle right now, it's sort of, oh shoot, I have to share my data, So I will say though, I mean, it's great. We obviously correspond with a lot of authors, and people are grateful. Like they say, thank you. Like, I didn't notice that. Oh, that makes it better. So I think after the process, people sort of maybe appreciate what the value was, but before you submit, you maybe aren't as aware. So it's one of those things when you're making a choice of where to share your data, and you have your grid, like curates, doesn't curate, like curates, does it really move it up on your list? I hope that we can bring more awareness to the value of that, but I'm not sure that's reached every researcher yet.
Great. A lot of support in the chat here for people should appreciate.
Yeah, they should.
Um,
We agree.
Any additional questions for Tracy or general conversation folks would like to have? Well, it seems like things are a little bit quiet at this point. This has really been great, Tracy. Thank you for sharing this, and we're going to amplify this out online with the recording. But I'll stop recording now. And everyone, if we could give a round of emoji applause. Is that what it is now? We'll do that. And thanks everyone for coming today, and thanks a whole bunch, Tracy.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me in and for this series in general. Really appreciate it. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Always happy to chat about data in general. So, all right.